you so much for joining me on the Creative Awakening Now podcast. I'm your host, David Matters, and I'm here to bring you stories, interviews, and insights relating to the topics of creativity, inspiration, and practice. My intention is to connect with other people who employ a heart-centered approach to the artistic process and to share this profoundly inspiring content with anyone who cares to hear it. I hope you enjoy. This is a dream, and a dream is never the same. My guest this week is Shugen Roshi. Geoffrey Shugen Arnold is Rōshi of the Mountains and Rivers Order, founded by John Daido Loori, from whom Shugen received Shiho or Dharma transmission in July 1997. As a lineage holder in the Sōtō tradition, Shugen currently serves as head of MRO and abbot of both Zen Mountain Monastery in Mount Tremper, New York, where he serves as the full-time resident teacher, and Zen Center of New York City in Brooklyn. Trained as a musician, Shugen was introduced to and began practicing Zen meditation in 1975. He began his formal training at Zen Mountain Monastery in 1984 and received tokudo, full monastic ordination, in 1988. Shugen's teachings have appeared in various Buddhist publications, including Buddhadharma, the Practitioner's Quarterly, The Mountain Record, and in The Best Buddhist Writing, 2005 and 2009. His Dharma talks are available for sale through the Monastery Store and as a free podcast at wzen.org. He is the author of O Beautiful End, a collection of Zen memorial poems published by Dharma Communications in 2012. And there's so much more to his story that we go deep into in this episode. So I'm not going to have to say too much about it because he lays it out beautifully for us. But just as a note, his musical training and his poetry were two big things that really drew me to him, and obviously for his Zen wisdom as well. He's been teaching for years and been training for many, many years, and but the fact that he has this deep connection with creativity as well as a formal spiritual practice in such a way was what really wanted me to reach out. And his teacher, Daido Loori, wrote several really incredible books, actually, but the one in particular, The Zen of Creativity, which had a huge effect on me. It's just a beautiful, amazing book, and it was Shugen's teacher that wrote that. And so I really wanted to touch base with him about that and kind of just get some insight from him and how it all kind of applied to him as a musician, as an artist, and as a practitioner. So it was really great. Super humble guy for being such a busy and wise individual who's got so much going on. He runs these two really large training centers in the monastery that have been around for a long time, and he teaches so many people all the time and hosts retreats and workshops and all kinds of things. So he's definitely got a lot going on. So him taking the time out of his schedule to do this interview with me was a really awesome thing. So I feel very honored and privileged to have this opportunity, and I know you guys are going to love it. So enjoy. That's all I got to say. Be sure to check out the monastery, the Zen Mountain Monastery's website. I'll have the links up and whatever else I can get for him. He doesn't have an Instagram or, as far as I know, a personal Facebook or anything like that. I don't even think the Zen Mountain Monastery does, and that's something that I really love about doing these kind of things with these teachers that are just so humble, so low-key. They're not out there on social media inflating themselves or trying to get followers. They do what they do because they love it. They're just doing it because of the sake of the Dharma, and it's part of who they are. So yeah, you're not gonna have a whole lot of luck connecting with them in that way, but hopefully you'll enjoy this episode and check out what they do, and maybe go and visit sometime if you're in New York. Who knows? But I also encourage you to check out my stuff that I have at creativeawakeningnow.com. I do have social media and such. I'm not so humble as that, and you can check me out there. You can check out my music, my band Life Like Water. You can check out some of my writings that I've had published, and my whole energy with this show, my whole intention with this show is to just kind of bridge this gap between creativity and deep personal development or spiritual growth, if you will, and how they have this really deep connection, this strong bond that goes between the two of them. And I like to bring that out in these kind of ways with these interviews. So anyway, enough rambling from me. Hope you really enjoyed this, and it's good to be back. I had a couple weeks off, actually, a little hiatus I was in retreat and holidays and all that stuff. So yeah, it was really fun to have this interview. It feels really good to be back. So hit me up if you have any suggestions for anyone to come on the show. And other than that, much love. Enjoy. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And thank you, Shugen, for being here with me today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Awesome. Well, we were just kind of chatting before we started recording about your past and your journey to Zen practice and the whole world of creativity that came about, the center that you were training at and your teacher. Maybe you could just give us a bit of a background about all that and how you got to where you are now.
Well, I grew up in the South. I grew up in Atlanta, and when I was in high school, I began to really wonder about things and wondered whether anybody knew what was going on. And I grew up in a non-religious home, so formal religion was not part of my upbringing at all. But at a certain point, I started to visit churches. My girlfriend was a little bit older. She had a car, so I talked her into taking us to different churches every Sunday, because I just wanted to see what was going on in there and whether it spoke to me. And I wasn't particularly inspired by what I saw, but I was definitely an outsider. I was looking at it as an outsider, so I understood that I didn't really understand, in a certain sense, what I was seeing. But at a certain point, I came across a book on Buddhism, on Zen, and I had been practicing music since I was a kid. I played the flute, and so I was accustomed to going into a room and practicing my instrument. And when I was looking for something that was to try and understand my life and the world around me, I had the sense that I was going to need to do something. I had a faith that it wasn't I wasn't looking for an ideology or a kind of philosophical approach to things. I had no confidence in just having ideas as a way to really address something in a more fundamental level, but I didn't know what that meant or what the implications of that might be. But when I came across this book on Buddhism and it spoke about meditation, I immediately felt kind of an affinity and an affirmation. On a certain level, that just made sense to me, that there was something that I could and would need to do. And I played around a little bit with meditation informally. And had always kind of been quiet by nature. I spent a lot of time in the woods, hiking and camping. Solitude was something that I enjoyed. And so that element, I think, also spoke to me. The fact that it was non-theistic also was important. There was nothing that I encountered, as I had in other spiritual traditions that I explored, that I kind of had to ignore, pretend I didn't just hear that or read that.
Yeah.
And so I just felt a very strong connection to Buddhism, even though I knew I didn't really understand it at all. And so I just began meditating and continued doing that on my own for about 10 years, during which time I had just graduated from high school. So during that time I traveled. I used to take a lot of cross-country bicycle trips, kind of exploring different parts of the country, doing odd jobs, just getting out there and having some experiences. And eventually I started school, university, and I was majoring in mathematics, which was another thing that I loved. And I got through my junior year and decided that I didn't want to devote my energies to that as my life's work. So I turned to the only other thing that I really cared about, which was music. And I had been practicing music all along and pretty seriously. So every day, even though I studied mathematics, I would practice 2 or 3 hours a day. And so I moved to New York. I had already moved up north to finish my school life, so I moved back to New York City where I'd spent some time and began preparing to apply for music schools. And so I eventually did that. I finished my degree in music and in both composition and performance. And then spent about a year or so, teaching and auditioning for, musicals and sort of pit orchestra jobs. And I also played Baroque music on original instruments, so I played in some early music ensembles. I did what every aspiring musician does, which is try and, keep things together. So I was waiting tables and trying to really, make a career in my music. And at a certain point, my Buddhist practice was continuing during all that time and getting increasingly more important. And in about 1984, late 84, early 85, I was living in the Hudson Valley in upstate New York, and I found out about the monastery. And so I came, and I immediately felt a resonance. I met who was the person who was to become my teacher, John Daido Loori, felt a very strong connection to him, and realized that Buddhism was much, much more than I had known it to be, which was really just meditation practice. And so I started coming every week and getting more involved. I became a student. And meanwhile, my sort of career was sort of going off in odd directions, and I realized it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And at a certain moment, and I remember exactly where I was, when I realized I wanted to make my life in the Dharma and become a monastic. And so I entered into formal residential training in 1986, was ordained in 88, and have really been here since then. I spent about 10 years at our temple in Brooklyn, New York, running that temple there, but a few years ago came back and am now here serving as the abbot. And so, so my Buddhist practice really, became the sort of essential force in my life. And, my teacher was a photographer and very much an artist, and his really entry into spiritual practice was through the arts. And he really, because of the relationship between Zen and the arts historically in China and Japan, that really turned him on. And so that was a really important element of the Zen tradition for him. But he also had a very strong spiritual drive. And so when he established the monastery, originally it was an arts center. So he saw it as a place where artists would come and really develop their art practice, but within the context of Buddhist practice. But after only a couple of years, the emphasis of the Sangha, the community, was that they really wanted more formal training. And so it kind of transitioned into being more of a formal training monastery, although the arts continued to be strong and a central part of his teaching, particularly in his latter years, where the arts became really a sort of a huge emphasis in his teaching. And that's when the Zen, the Art of Creativity, was published, and a lot of his other works. And he was also photographing all throughout the time that he was here. And we also have attracted a lot of artists because of that emphasis on the arts. For me, oddly, entering into formal training was sort of the end of my musical career. In a way by choice, because, I'd been playing at aspiring to be a professional musician. So it was really, I was playing at a fairly decent level and putting a lot of time and energy into it. And being a monastic, I just couldn't do that. My time is not wholly my own. It's really given in service to the community. And so when I was able to play, it wasn't that enjoyable. Because I was losing my chops, And so at a certain point, I just decided that chapter of my life felt kind of resolved and completed, and I really didn't feel a strong urge to continue. I kind of directed those creative energies towards poetry. So that's more been what I've been doing in sort of creative expression for the last 20 years, really, 25 years.
Wow, that's
Very comprehensive introduction right there. Thank you for that. It's,
Too much.
no, definitely not. You touched on a lot of the stuff that I wanted to go into, and it's just fascinating. I shown you that the Zen of Creativity was such a big eye opener for me when I came upon it, and it it made the connection for my Zen practice and my creative side, and I knew it was there, but I didn't quite understand it. And then that book came along, and boom, it came about. And I'm wondering if you could maybe um, talk about your experience with that. I know that obviously you transitioned out of focusing so much on music, but obviously the creative energy is still very much there, and all the poetry you're doing. And I mean, Zen in itself is a very creative uh, practice. And that it's been my experience that it really has this its own energy that you can call its own art form. Um, can you maybe talk about your experience with that, and even the tradition itself, like how that came about, like how Zen art became a thing?
Hmm. Well, it's interesting how in most of the major religions, the art, creative expression is part of it because it's such a sort of an essential part of human nature. Even in any human endeavor, there's
Hmm.
creativity. And so, but in terms of the arts in China, what really was some of the basic functionings of a monastery, so arranging flowers or offering tea or calligraphy or painting, poetry, which are used in all different kinds of teaching and liturgy, became more formalized and really integrated by some of these early Zen priests who were Zen poets and painters and so on. And then in Japan, it was continued to be developed and really refined into a very high degree. So much so that it even became kind of divorced, certainly in present times, from Buddhism and from Zen practice and any sort of direct connection to spiritual practice. Although if you engage it in those traditional forms, a practitioner can see the connection. And so the history is really quite kind of extraordinary and rather unique. In a lot of religions, the creative expression is used as a kind of a way to celebrate the important figures, to worship, express devotion. In Buddhism, really all the schools of Buddhism, it's more used to complement and develop one's meditation. So whether it's a mandala or some of the depictions of the Buddhism bodhisattvas, visualizations, these creative expressions are really used more for meditation. They all obviously have an aesthetic quality. They're beautiful. They're done in a very meditative way. They're created in a state of meditation.
Hmm.
And that's really their function. In the Zen tradition, they became teachings. And so the poetry, the poetry linked with paintings often were teachings, that a teacher would offer to a student. I do the same thing, offer a poem to a student sometimes as a teaching when I do a memorial service or a funeral or a wedding for that matter. I write a poem which is really a Dharma teaching that has to do with the essential nature of whatever that service is about, whether it be life and death, whether it be sort of a spiritual union in a marriage. And so that's one of the unique things about the arts in the Zen tradition. And the way Daido Roshi taught it was he spoke of it as a way of expressing the inexpressible, which I always really loved. And I thought really got to the heart of the matter because, art in its essence is not an intellectual process. It's something that comes from a very deep, we might say intuitive part of our consciousness and our being. Mm-hmm. And developing our skill as an artist allows us to express it more freely. And that's true in any, field. The more skill we develop, the more sort of we can forget the skill and manifest that in a more spontaneous and natural way. But one of the things that Daido Roshi emphasized was the arts for everyone, that everyone basically has creativity, has creative expression, and that it's not ultimately about the skill, it's about the expression itself. And so everyone in our way of training engages the arts. whether they have any skill or not. And so there, it's really about trying to stay true to that which is being expressed. And so usually when we do art practice formally, I'll offer a teaching, or I'll take a quote from Dogen, for instance, or some other teacher that is, in essence, a question or a kind of koan that the student then works with in their meditation and then tries to express directly through whatever their medium is. And the practice is to try and stay grounded and connected, mindful, and in a state of concentration to that thing that they're trying to express, and not get outside of themselves to think about what does this mean, how does this appear, is this good or bad, how is it going to be viewed, in other words, to stay out, to let go of the witness and try and stay very inside, intimate with the process of the creative expression itself. So in that way, it becomes very much akin to the practice of meditation, where you're really going deeply into whatever your meditation is and letting go of that self-awareness, that self-critic, who is commenting and judging and so on, and trying to just stay intimately connected with the thing itself.
Yeah, I think that's amazing that you have people focus in that way, people who probably aren't, artistically inclined, in their everyday lives, but then applying it to practice. It makes so much sense to me, as an artist and as somebody who practices, but it may not make sense to other people, and that's why I wanted to kind of go into it and try and get a professional opinion, if you will, being someone who's been so close to it. And the whole topic of Zen seems very elusive to people, seems very out there. Like, I literally a friend and I have been corresponding, and I've been trying to share my understandings. He's curious about Zen, and he's also a creative person, and I make the connections. And his recent letter that he sent me was like, I still just don't really get it. Zen is just so out there. How do you make this connection? And I want to explain how grounded it really is, and how practical it is to our moment-to-moment experience, but it's so hard to articulate. And art is a very good way to do that. And maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit more on the Zen side of things. How is it that somebody from the outside could look at Zen and say, oh yeah, that's a creative practice? Or, how is it that, what is the essence of Zen, if you will?
Well, when the Buddha, right after his enlightenment, he, by his own account, considered that he would not teach for two reasons. One, because, as he said, he felt that people were in general too infatuated with their attachments, too attached to their suffering, really, to be able to deeply consider a teaching that could liberate them from that suffering. He also deliberated or paused as to whether he should teach, because he said this Dharma is subtle and profound and cannot be observed with the senses. And so that's why it's a mystic path. That's why we sit in a meditation hall, on a meditation seat, the diamond seat, the indestructible diamond of wisdom, rather than in a classroom. Because it's not about the exchange of ideas or the accumulation of knowledge, even though ideas are part of gaining an initial understanding of Buddhist practice. What we call practice, like in meditation, is a direct path, a direct turning to the study and examination of the human mind. And in that, a direct experience of our fundamental nature that is free of all of the ideas and the socialized conditioning that we've all absorbed and become part of, and that we see as the world and as ourselves. And so it's really, all of the emphasis on letting go in Buddhism is because attachments are suffering, but it's that which we attach to that basically becomes a kind of blinder, a kind of screen that because it's our consciousness, it's the way we see things, it taints or colors everything that we perceive through the senses. And so, you think of Western art, where so much of the mystique of the arts is sort of the tortured artist, right? The suffering, anguished artist. Van Gogh is sort of a classic sort of model. And so, the idea of, well, if the suffering self is realized to be empty of any inherent suffering itself, any inherent independent existence, then what is expression? What is creative expression? If it's not all about me, my personality, myself, my suffering, my desires, if it's not all about me, then what is it? From a Western perspective, that almost, just stops the conversation because we're so embedded and kind of wedded to this notion of the self as being the thing that drives everything. And so in the Zen arts, the creative expression is going hand in hand with a moral practice, a teaching of compassion, and learning how to live without creating harm, and developing genuine, deep concern for all beings. It goes hand in hand with developing our meditation, which means a deep practice of mindfulness and the deepening of that into a state of concentration that allows us to see things as they are, which we can't do when we're in a distracted state of mind. And so the arts when we engage in it, it's really happening within this whole path, the Eightfold Path, in which the arts are a way to both develop those other aspects, compassion, concentration, and insight, and in a way that's wedded to this very sort of inherent and sort of wondrous aspect of human nature, which is our creativity. One of the interesting things, and this is often talked about, is that if you go into a room of 5-year-olds and you ask, how many of you can write a poem? How many of you can paint or draw? They'll all raise their hands, right? And then you just wait a few years, and after a few years, only a few will, right? And so creativity, I had that experience in school, where creativity was real creativity was discouraged, and pretty explicitly, in terms of really just giving freedom to be able to express, but rather what I experienced both in poetry and in painting was that it was either explained to death, so that I wasn't interested anymore, or it was kind of taken over by the teacher, and I was told to do things a certain way. And of course, as a musician, I studied classical music, so I trained in a very particular, style in which there's sort of following in the footsteps of the masters, of the ancestors. And so, but that was how I developed my skill. What I'm talking about is, in my early years, was something else, where just that pure sort of joy of creativity was not really present in my experience. And I think that's true for a lot of people. So a lot of our students, when they engage our practice, are scared to death. And they say, no, I can't do this. I'm not good at this. And so part of what we have to work with is really helping them to free themselves from that notion, that inner critic, of who they are and what they can and can't do.
Yeah, that's when I first presented this subject to my teacher, kind of combining my Zen practice with my creativity. One of the first things that I was talking to her about was like, how do I engage my creativity, my practice, and my, me, and that she was just like, stop, like right there, like focus on your first person pronoun, like whose creativity, who is there to have this, and why is that entity so attached to their own creative process. And that I just had never thought about it like that. The whole notion of expression and creativity in our culture is so egocentric most of the time. It's all about me fulfilling something, or me expressing myself, or creating something to give to the world. And the Zen perspective was this like total shift of things.
Well, so like if you sort of think of it in terms of meditation practice, so you're sitting, focusing on the breath, say, and a thought arises, or a memory or an emotion arises. So the practice is to just see it, not to see it as my thought, my emotion, my memory, but just thought. just sensation. And so when we let go of that sort of self-referencing, what remains is just the thing itself. And so then if you think of creativity that way, that when it's not, obviously there is someone who is creating, right? But when they're not sort of doing it from that self-referential place, then it's just the creativity itself. And then the art is liberated. In my own experience, when I first came in and tried to do art practice, as when I was in formal training, I naturally went to my music. And so I'd take up my instrument and I'd work with the assignment, whatever it was, which was never linear. It was never, it was always working with things in a very sort of exploded way, and which meant I couldn't rely on concepts. But what I inevitably found myself doing was kind of reverting to my training. And so, because I had spent so many years since I was a kid training in a classical style, that everything that I ended up doing just felt like what I had been trained to do. I had a very hard time breaking out of it. So after several years, I got frustrated. I thought, you know what, I'm not going to do music. I'm going to do something where I don't have all this history. And so I decided to just do some simple watercolor painting. And it was so freeing because I had no investment. I didn't expect to be good at this, right? I hadn't trained in this, so I could really sort of be very innocent and just go to it where there was just the medium itself. And I wasn't sort of dragged down by all of these years of conditioning, in a sense. And that really shifted things for me. I felt like suddenly I was starting to understand what my teacher was trying to do with art practice. And then I was able to go back to the music after having developed that a while and approach it in a different way. I used to have a teacher when I was studying formally, a music teacher, who used to say, every month when I see you, I want you to do something with the instrument that I haven't taught you to do. Make a sound that you haven't been taught to make. And this was classical training. This is not the kind of stuff normally you would do on when you're playing Bach or Mozart. But it was such a wonderful exercise that in a way I wasn't even ready for it. He was almost prescient in terms of introducing me to a way of thinking that it took years, before I had some better sense of when I was practicing Buddhism.
Yeah, that's the idea of conditioning and being, you put all this energy into like learning something, into being a certain way, and it's great, like obviously to have that training, and it's the only way to learn, to repetition and doing things, but it gets so ingrained in you. And I've been a musician most of my life, but I was never formally trained. I'm more of a folk musician, but even that, it was the same kind of thing with songwriting for me. It became like, okay, I know what works for me, and I have this process, and I cling to that process. And when it doesn't come through and it doesn't work out, I don't get the song I want, or I'm in a dry spell or something, there's suffering. Truly, I suffer from it, and I beat myself up, and I get, this whole story gets connected with it. Well, I'm not good enough, or I just didn't learn fast enough, or whatever it is. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just kind of part of the process. But I wasn't really able to see that until I started creating from that other perspective, where it was just like you were saying, like kids, just doing it because you love it and expressing it, and then bringing the form in, then bringing the technique in, and allowing it to nourish that spontaneous kind of creation that is always there. That is at the core of of all of us, of all living beings. And I find it so interesting that you do that as part of the formal training at the monastery there. Do you have specific styles or modalities that you do there, like traditional Zen creative practices, or do you do basically anything?
Both.
Yeah.
So there are some people who will take up the traditional arts like tea ceremony or calligraphy or painting, shakuhachi, bamboo flute. But I would say most of the most of the students, use more Western or contemporary forms. So what I've been doing more of late when we do this is trying to get people to use an art form in which they are directly using their hands and are in contact. Because we had a lot of people that were going towards digital art forms, which has its own value. And we have some people in the Sangha who do incredible work, on the computer. But I think more and more as we go more sort of technologically inclined, part of our practice is sort of preserving some of these ancient arts. And part of that is the human body as an instrument. The human body, in a sense, as a machine, in the best sense of the word. Not an industrial machine, but a machine that is in direct contact with the physical world. And then I think for me, part of the arts, is that physical contact, that you're using your body in combination, for instance, with a musical instrument, which is a miracle. I mean, it's a miracle what we were able to do when you watch somebody play an instrument, like a banjo, like I see sitting on your wall behind you. I mean, really, it's extraordinary. And so I've been trying to encourage that more. And sometimes with students who are really get locked into that conditioning, like I was, I will encourage them to, try an art form they have no history with. That can help. Because sometimes there's just too much investment. There's too much of an expectation. I put all this energy and this has to look good or this has to sound good. But another thing that I do is I encourage people sometimes as a way of trying to develop this, to separate out their sort of trained art form. And if they're a performer or an artist, to just keep doing that. But then have some time where they take up their medium without the intention to perform or show it to anybody. So that you can really be alone with yourself and just let yourself explore things in a way that you might not if you expected you were going to be performing this, right? Because it's hard to let go of that. I mean, it's like you explained, like you get frustrated, it's not working. And so what's the basis of that frustration? It can be just our own desire of how we want this to be going or what we expect it to be. It can also be because this isn't going to work, for an audience some way. How is that going to be judged? So just try and free oneself where it doesn't matter. It's not, no one's going to see this.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, you can do anything. Right? And that sometimes helps to just free things up a little bit so that we begin to experience the possibilities. And then as we gain more confidence in that, then sometimes I think we'll naturally begin to bring elements of that, back into our more formal artwork. Sometimes people ask, well, what is the difference between, a meditator or somebody who's studying the Dharma, or an art training doing creative expression and somebody who's not. You can say the same thing for activism. For a Buddhist to be an activist, working for social justice, what's the difference? And I think that's a very interesting question and something that we shouldn't rush to answer, because in a way, the internal part of it, what's happening inside of you is the most important part. And rather than trying to construct or contrive a kind of outer expression, of a kind of identity, as a practitioner, which usually doesn't work out very well, because it's contrived.
For sure. Yeah, I had this kind of existential crisis some years ago after I was in a band, and it was following my dreams and finding success, and you're doing the thing, and then it fell apart for various reasons, and my whole life just kind of crumbled before me. And I was depressed, and I was angry, and I was sad, and I had all these things going through. And then that's really when my serious practice started, my sitting practice. And this was about, I don't know, 4 years ago or so. And I had been practicing up before that for years, but not as dedicated. And when I started sitting more and allowing that sadness and that anger and that depression and just kind of sitting with it, I realized that there was still this creative urge within me that I thought was just going to like dry up, like wither away and blow off with the wind, and my whole like romantic ideas. And what came out of it was the same thing as you said. I picked up a new medium because I didn't want to focus on what I had been doing because it hurt too much, but I couldn't stop. So I started doing pyrography, wood burning, and I had no idea what I was doing. Picked up the thing, and it was awful. The first, I don't even know how many months, it was terrible. But I loved it so much, I just kept doing it and kept doing it and kept doing it. And then finally, like, I had this kind of breakthrough with it where I was loving what I was doing, and it was producing some pretty good stuff. And in this whole time, I kind of just let my music, I was still playing, but I let it hang out. And when I brought that energy from the wood burning back to my music, it was like this revitalized approach to it all, and everything changed for me, and it opened up this whole new avenue. And like you're saying, like taking that, not necessarily separating them, but that is something that I've personally experienced and know the power of. And you take that, the energy is always there, and as long if you can just bring it out, nurture it gently, and allow yourself to suck for a while and not be so connected to your ideas of success, it really does produce some incredible things. I've seen that firsthand.
And I think of this, as a part of, how is this part of Buddhist practice? That for a Buddhist practitioner, somebody who's living a contemplative or meditative life, what that means is that every day, or almost every day, you go to your cushion, because that's what your life is about, and that it's not based on how you feel. That if you feel good or not, whether you're emotionally stable or upset, whether you're rested or not, that's part of what happens in formal training. Every day, residents here at the monastery wake up early before the sun rises and go in to meditate. And, guaranteed, on any given morning, there's a whole spectrum of how people feel about that. But what's happening in that process, in that kind of perseverance, and just keep going, keep returning, keep coming back to that place, is we develop not just a confidence, but a kind of spaciousness and expansiveness. It's like if you want to be a sailor, you have to go out sailing on the ocean in all kinds of weather. You can't just go when it's sunny and you've got a good breeze. And so I think of the same thing in terms of spiritual practice. I think of the same things in terms of creativity. I remember an interview years ago with somebody, an author who'd written a book, sort of examining the creative process of a whole range of sort of very well-known artists in all these different mediums. And the one thing that he found was consistent in everyone, and these artists lived very different lives. Some were very sort of bohemian, and some were very sort of straight-laced. But the one thing that was consistent was that every morning, no matter what had happened the night before or how late they'd been up, they woke up and they went into their studio and they did their work. And that discipline, which I think of not as a constraint, which is how many people think of discipline, doing what you don't want to do.
Yeah.
But rather, how do we follow through on something that we have decided deep within us is important to us and that we want to do? But you're not going to want to do every day, right? You're not always going to want to do it. And so how do you connect with that deeper part of yourself that has aspiration, so that you can continue to develop that, whether it's a spiritual practice, whether it's a creative practice. When I was a kid, there were lots of times I would come home from school and I'd hear my friends out playing, and I'd think, oh God, I really want to go out and play, but then I would think, but I really want to learn how to play this instrument. And I thought the only way I'm going to do that is if I keep sticking with it. And so I would do that, and then I'd go out and play.
Yeah. Yeah, that, the idea of discipline is it does have such a nasty connotation to it. Maybe it's everywhere, definitely in our culture, having this strict regiment, like militaristic view of things. But I've personally seen that it's not that way. And like you said, it gives you, I don't know, it's like it fortifies the foundation of what you're doing. And it's like sesshin. They're doing a retreat. I just got out of the retreat here at the Zen Center in Asheville, and the sitting, the amount of energy that goes into it, and the pain and the mind states and all that stuff. It can be torture at moments, and you sit through it and you're like, why am I doing this? But at the end of it, I feel like it's kind of just like after you play a concert and the whole thing, even if there's bad sound, crazy crowd, whatever it is, when you finally finish, it's got this like completed feel to it, that you pushed through, you persevered, and you engaged with that thing that's at the core of your being, and when you really approach creativity like that, same as your spiritual practice, I've found that there's this fulfilling nature to discipline. There's this really grounding sense of, I don't know, it's like you're coming home to who you are, and through this thing that is really not you. You're kind of like overcoming yourself to find yourself, in a way.
Yeah, and one will necessarily have to encounter moments just as you described, where you're stuck, where you're frustrated, it's not working. And to persevere, just to stay steady. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes things possible, whether it's on the meditation seat or whether it's in a creative process. I remember years ago when I was in music school, there was a very, very accomplished, sort of a world-renowned pianist who came and did master classes and then did a performance. And I did some master classes with him just as a flutist, and because I was working on a performance and preparing with a pianist. Mm-hmm. And after he'd done all this that night, he gave a performance, and I was standing around with a bunch of friends, non-musicians, and some musicians afterwards, and some of them were saying, "Oh, I'd so love to play like he plays." Hmm. And I looked at them and I said, "Would you really?" Because what I was seeing, what they were hearing, what I imagined is like, I would love to play like that. Yeah. What I was seeing in that performance was the years and years and hours of dedicated work. And it's like, do you really want to play like that? Yeah. Really know what that requires? And of course, everybody, most people are not going to do any kind of art on that level, nor should they. Mm-hmm. I think that's really important, particularly as we're talking about discipline, which I really feel sometimes students will say, I hate that word, when I talk about a spiritual life as a discipline life. I said, it doesn't mean militaristic. It doesn't mean, confined. It's liberating. Mm-hmm. When you are able to follow through on what you yourself have decided is really important to you, then that allows you to do that thing. Mm-hmm. And so I say, if you don't like the word discipline, find another word that basically means the same thing. Yeah. It's perseverance. In Buddhism, the virtue of constancy, being steadfast, is so important, as it is in any endeavor, whether it's a relationship, whether it's a meditation practice, whether it's being a teacher in a classroom. You have to develop your skills, to do anything. Mm-hmm. And that takes time and energy, and it's not always going to be a pleasant or enjoyable experience, but it can be a joyful experience, I believe, even when it's hard. Mm-hmm. If you really sort of have a way in, to engage and you have faith in what you're doing and love what you're doing, then that love you can draw on that love even in the moments when you're pissed at it. Mm-hmm. I hate my instrument. Yeah. And there were times where it's like, I don't want to play this thing ever again. Yeah. But just because I was frustrated. Mm-hmm. But then I would tap into that deeper love of music, and sort of comebacks like, okay, stop complaining, stop whining, just start over. Yeah,
that's it, starting fresh, coming back to it. Yeah, man, there's so many things I could ask you. I realize we're running short on time. You have a time constraint. I'm just wondering if there's any chance that you have any of your poetry nearby that you might be able to share with us. Do you have anything that you could tap into, or is that kind of too off the cuff?
No, I could do that. I could. Let's see.
Well, I'll give you a second to look for it and just say that I'm really grateful for this conversation. It touches so close to home for me, and it's something that I think a lot of people are curious about, this resurgence of a deeper some might say spiritual connection to creativity is such a beautiful thing. And the city I live in, Asheville, is just full of it. It's blossoming more and more. People are just trying to connect on a deeper level, whether they call it spiritual or not. It's more personal. It's more compassionate, loving, all these things. So this talk we're having right now is a very good jumping off place for people, I think. So I hope it is helpful for people, and I'm really grateful for you sharing your time with us. I know you're very busy and you have a lot going on, but
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So here's a poem that maybe sort of goes along with what we've been talking about. And this I did for a couple that I performed a marriage for some years ago. There's a quiet way that trusts without certainty, speaks without language, gives without burdening, searching, do not turn back, finding, protect as your own breath, taking delight. This you already know. You already know. How else does the fledgling leave her nest, falling into the boundless sky, wings finding their natural ability? Here today, who can explain this great leap into the one? You already know.
Thank you. There's something so... it's funny to use words, especially in the Zen tradition, like poetry, to touch on something so deep, but it's when you use them right, it's right there. It just opens things up. And I've heard you talk about poetry and different things in some of your Te shows, some of your Dharma talks through the center, and it drew me to your teaching, and it drew me to kind of seek you out and ask you to come on. So, like I said, I'm very, very grateful for you to come on, and I don't know if there's any information. I always ask my guests if they have anything that they want to share with people. I don't know how that works with the Zen Center.
Well, we have a website in which the talks that I give and the other teachers and seniors give are available for free. So that's available to anybody who's interested. And if anybody who's interested in Zen Buddhism or a particular training center, there's information there. I did, with the help of a couple of students who were writers and publishers, produce a book a few years ago of memorial poems. These were poems that were written specifically for various Sangha members, community members who had died over the years. So that's also available through our store. It's called Oh Beautiful End. But I would just encourage people. I really appreciated you doing this, and because I really want to encourage the arts. I feel like they're a little bit under siege in our society these days.
Yeah.
They're really undervalued, and I think, people who taste that part of our nature know, how essential creativity and creative expression is, how artists, I feel, are, some of the most important members of our society. And not just highly accomplished artists, but anyone, everyone who's engaging in creative expression. It keeps us closely connected to our world, to each other, to our inner experience of things. And I think, that the relationship between that and any spiritual practice is, in a way, if you just engage both paths, you'll see over time the connection within oneself. And I think that's, a way of helping us to see the sacred in our world and to see how precious things are, how precious life is and living creatures are. I think that's part of what the arts do, is enliven, is make the body electric. So I appreciate your wanting to do this, and I too hope that in some small way this has been helpful.
Yeah, it's definitely been helpful for me alone, if nothing else. It's great to hear it, and I know the listeners are going to enjoy it. So once again, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll be able to talk again in the future. Maybe I'll make it out to New York someday.
Great. Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.